Welcome to AHRC TV's weekly roundup. The following are the stories covered in this week's program. United Nations turns 70. Reflection on its achievements and failings. Sri Lanka commemorates the tens of thousands of disappeared for the 25th time. Bangladesh descend into authoritarian lawlessness. Interview with former parliamentarian Mahi Chowdhury. Jorge Vargas of the Malaysian bar on defending on the rule of law. Welcome to AHRC TV's weekly roundup. I am Amila Sampath. 70 years ago, a few weeks after the end of the World War II, on the 24th of October 1945, the United Nations Charter was enacted. All sovereign states of the world today are members of the United Nations, and countless declarations and conventions have been signed and ratified over the last 70 years. One of the key mandates of the UN was to define and protect universal human rights. In this program, AHRC TV explored to what extent has this been successful. In what respect have the UN succeeded, and where has it failed in its universal human rights project? And where should the organization go from here? During the 4th Annual Asian Alliance Against Torture and Ill-Treatment meeting held in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago, parliamentarians and human rights defenders discussed the UN's failing and future direction. Here is Russian human rights lawyer Sergei Golubov and Martin Anderson, researcher for Dignity Institute in Denmark.
It's a constant issue, both informally and formally, in interactions with the United Nations staff, with the United Nations experts. We need new ideas. And everyone realizes that it's a paradigm shift right now. And they realize the ideas can be supplied only by people who work on the ground, who work with the victims of human rights violations. And it's our role to explain to the United Nations and to our communities that actually you need freedom of expression to arrive to better solutions, to go on with the development. It's not only good to have freedom of expression, it's also beneficial to have freedom of expression. You need to get rid of torture to make your own police forces more efficient. Not because it's right to be free of torture. It's definitely right. Not only because it's right to be free of torture, but it's also because it's beneficial for everyone, including for the torturers, to be free of torture, because they are victimized as well. Not on par with victims, but they are also victimized. So I think one of the paths should be the route through explanation of human rights through their linkages to the development, to the global goals.
When you were trying diagnosing your situations in your different countries, you would end up in, we have to change the prosecutor. We have to do another statutory law changing this. But that is exactly the same way in which the UN system thinks, that there is a technical solution to political problems. And that's why we have ended up now there's research coming out now from many places saying that all these technical things we've tried to change, reform societies, have failed. And we have invested so much money and time and effort into this. And if people just have asked people from where you come from, what are the real problems, then we might have ended up in another place. So I think one of the basic things the think tank wants to do is actually to go back to these people sitting the high-ups, saying maybe we should start where the problems are, instead of starting in the UN institutions, right? UN institutions have a mandate. They have an idea of how to fix the world. And then they will go out from the UN and try and do stuff. And we all know this doesn't work. And when you meet them in your different places, you kind of, yes, fine, nice, good. And then they pass on, and 2 years down the line, nothing has happened. So it's a kind of trying to engage in that conversation with the people who actually should know better, the people within the UN system, but are, I think, like we have, they're blind to it. And they are deliberately blind to it. Because it means they have to think politically. And that is much more difficult than thinking technically.
United Nations is a sum of the member states. It's the common will of the of all member states of the humanity. And if United Nations is weak, that means that humanity wants it to be weak. If it's strong, that means we all want it to be strong. So after all, it's up to us to lobby our governments, or to lobby our different governments, if need arises, to make United Nations stronger, to empower United Nations. United Nations itself does not act. Secretariat of the United Nations implement the decisions taken by the member states. The idea we should not wait for some decision from the United Nations. It will never arrive. It's up to us to make United Nations working again.
AHRC TV sat down with Bijo Francis, Asian Human Rights Commission's Executive Director, to get his view of the UN role today and for the future.
Well, insofar as the United Nations as an organization is concerned, it has achieved a lot from the point at which it was constituted to where we are today. The main area where the UN has made achievements are on two aspects. One, it has set a large set of norms concerning human rights, and it has also provided an open and transparent platform where these concerns of human rights could be expressed, brought up, discussed and debated. It has also spent enormous resources in terms of time and finances to globally spread or globally bring the awareness of these norms to some of even the remotest parts of the world. So in that sense, the UN has contributed exceptionally, as it is expected to, as an international organization when it comes to the question of human rights, raising the awareness of human rights. There are criticisms, however, concerning the functioning of the United Nations. More importantly, it is related to the sluggishness with which the institution is a bit infamous for in terms of the responses that as an agency that it should respond. One will also have to understand that how institutions at the local level fail on one hand to protect and promote the rights that is now globally set as norms, whereas on the other hand, how as an institution the United Nations could actually contribute towards the development of the local debates. In other words, it requires, such an engagement requires a very methodical and very deep understanding of the realities that exist at the local level. Now, human rights treaties, human rights norms and guarantees, human rights expectations, also to be realized requires a political change at the local level. So in that sense, human rights is also political work. So when we say that a country has ratified ICCPR, it is or any other important convention like the Convention Against Torture or any other documents, it is an important step in itself. But then when it comes to realization of these rights, UN as a body and other international specialist agencies which work under the United Nations or which work closely with the United Nations also need to understand that it is not enough to say that a convention is to be ratified or signed. It is not enough to recommend the states to put these conventions into practice. It is not enough today to assume that if as a body United Nations make a recommendation to the particular state party in question that it is encouraged to implement these conventions in letter and spirit, or if a case is brought to a treaty body mechanism requesting the treaty body to investigate, prosecute and adjudicate the subject matter of that case or that incident. Because it is for the very fact that a complaint making process followed by an investigation and a prompt adjudication is not possible that these cases are brought towards attention or towards these treaty bodies. Or rather, the UN has to come out of the shell of making a recommendation to the state saying that these cases of torture should be investigated, prosecuted and adjudicated. It should go beyond to find out what are the hindrances in the state that prevents complaint making, that on the first hand makes it possible that torture exists in that jurisdiction. And then what prevents a proper investigation? What are the challenges in investigating cases? and what are the challenges that at the domestic level the people face, the advocates face, the human rights lawyers face, the victims face when it comes to a proper adjudication of a torture claim. It is only when you understand the finite nuances, the failures of the domestic mechanisms, you can actually intervene on that circumstances.
Next, in this week's program, Sri Lankas Disappeared have been commemorated for the 25th time at the Monument of Disappeared in Radhaluwa near Colombo. Like every year, speeches were delivered and flowers were laid at the monument by human rights defenders, religious leaders, and family members of the tens of thousands of people who have been disappeared over the last 3 decades, mainly in the late 80s and early 90s. The same kind of breakdown of the rule of law that resulted in tens of thousands of disappearances in Sri Lanka can also be seen in today's Bangladesh. Human rights defenders, journalists, and opposition politicians are constantly disappeared or killed, and the so-called democracy in the country has become a bad joke. Only the ruling party participated in the last election, and police and paramilitary forces are acting as an enforce for the rulers rather than as a protectors of the law and the people. Earlier, AHRC TV spoke with former Member of Parliament Mahi Chowdhury about the state of lawlessness in the country.
When we started the journey towards democracy, we have developed a very unique style of democracy. A democracy which is practiced basically for one day, only during the day of the election. And other than that, for the rest of 5 years, we don't talk about democracy. And people at large have somehow started believing that democracy means only to have a fair election where they can actually go out and vote and their vote will be counted, and that's all democracy is all about. But which is not the case. So what I mean that, in the last 25 years, which is a pretty long time, we often hear that, people say that change doesn't come overnight. It is a matter of a process, so we have to give it time. But we have given 25 years, and we couldn't institutionalize democracy. The democratic institutions were not developed. We still could not have a proper election commission which is acceptable by the general people. We could not have a proper independent and sovereign judiciary which can perform independently. We do not even have a proper department of prosecution. We have a police department which acts like a front organization of the political party in power, and we couldn't do much about it. And the problem is that we have the nation somehow developed some sort of a tolerance towards it. People have started accepting everything. Whatever happens, people started accepting it. That okay, this will happen. It's a state of hopelessness among the generation, that people have lost hope, that change will not come in this country. When it comes to the culture of torture in the society, we have discussed it many times, that torture is actually one of the biggest industry in the country. Torture and extortion, the amount of money that is flowing in this culture of torture is so big that if somebody needs to fight it, it is the government, it is the institutions, it is the people at large has to join together and has to fight it. Otherwise, it is impossible to fight that thing. When it comes to fair trial, same thing. It's a culture, because we don't have fair trial. Currently, we are facing a lot of problems in that regard, and to bring an institutional change, especially in the criminal justice system, to ensure fair trial for its citizens, we need to start at some point. I think that planting seed has not taken place.
Finally, HRC TV brings you an interview with Jorge Vargas, Vice President of the Malaysian Bar Association, who was at the roundtable meeting on Asia Rule of Law Institution and Human Rights in Hong Kong earlier this month. The meeting was organized by the International Legal Assistance Consortium, or ILAC, and the Asian Human Rights Commission. Vargas talked about what the Malaysian Bar stands for and the kind of activities held to protect the rule of law and the protest actions when serious breaches were occurred. Here is Vargas, interviewed by ILAC per Lankas Storm.
We continuously get involved in activities to make sure that the rule of law is preserved, and whenever there are serious challenges to human rights, we take the necessary actions to preserve human rights in Malaysia. And this is a continuous effort, and the things that we do also changes with the issues that the Malaysian Bar faces. Hence why I say it's not just an organization taking care of the interests of lawyers, but under the Legal Profession Act in Malaysia, we have to play a wider role. And this is a role which is a continuous role which we have to continue to carry out in order to make sure that systems are in place, things are proper in Malaysia. We foresee big challenges ahead of us. Already there are quite a few very draconian legislations being passed and implemented. We see that as a breach of human rights, and we will continue to oppose these legislations. We will engage with the right people in order to see some form of change. And yes, international organizations, not just ILAC, even other international organizations have over the years supported the cause of the Malaysian Bar. And this has always helped. Some international assistance gives some form of pressure onto the government as well when they see that international bodies are also looking at what is happening. This inevitably places pressure on them to do the right thing.
That is all for this weekly roundup. For more on these and other issues, please visit www.humanrights.asia. Thank you for watching and see you next week.